Tonight on Primetime Politics, addressing his critics.
Do I still have the understanding of what this is going to take to win the next election?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The Prime Minister defends his leadership in an interview with one of his own MPs. Coming up, we'll hear what Justin Trudeau had to say, and we'll get reaction from our political strategists. We'll hear what they have to say about Trudeau's arguments for staying, even as polls suggest Canadians are done with him. Also, are the Liberals' falling numbers inspiring a revival in Quebec's sovereignty? We'll speak to polls analyst Philippe Fournier, who says yes. And
we need a pause for peace talks to happen.
The challenge of getting Canadians out of harm's way in Lebanon. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. For well over a year now, we have heard the question from people outside the Liberal Party, from people inside the Liberal Party, wondering why the Prime Minister is choosing to stay when his party, under his leadership, is doing so badly in the polls. So bad, in fact, that come the next election, if numbers hold, Liberals could find themselves going from government to third-party status in the House. Still, the Prime Minister says he is determined to fight the next election, saying it most recently in an interview with one of his MPs.
Whatever this next election is going to be about, I think the pattern of crises that we've hit, whether they've been economic or military or geopolitical or health, have not been something that was on the ballot or even discussed in the debate.
Yeah.
And that idea of knowing someone's values, knowing the frame with which they approach challenges, is not just important, it's ultimately sort of the only thing.
And that interview was with Toronto Liberal MP Nate Erskine-Smith, who has his own podcast. It is called Uncommons. And to talk about what we just heard, we're now joined by our strategist. Susan Smith is principal with Blue Sky Strategy Group, Cole Hogan, principal with GT & Company, and Nasha Brownridge, senior consultant with Strategy Core. Hello to the three of you.
Hello. Michael. Hi, Michael.
So, it was interesting because, for months now, people have been wondering, why is the Prime Minister staying in the fight, even if his poll numbers are bad? And when you listen to that interview, again, with Erskine-Smith, he talks about having the drive, he talks about being able and knowing how to fight Conservatives. But it also seems large part of it has to do with preserving legacy, because he talked a lot about what he's already accomplished. He didn't really outline what he's hoping to achieve if he is elected again in government. What do you make of what we heard from the Prime Minister?
I don't think I would call it legacy. I think when you've been a Prime Minister for a certain amount of time, you have to be prepared to defend what it is you've put in place. And I think that Prime Minister Trudeau sees it as a differentiator between himself and Mr. Poilievre. Like Mr. Poilievre, they haven't put all the new things in the window. Some of the things that they're going to be fighting on, dental care, school lunch program, the Canada Child Benefit, those programs for families he's talking about. I don't know so much that it's a legacy, but he does want people to be thinking about the question. You know what we stand for, what Liberals stand for, this Prime Minister speaking. What does that guy stand for? And, the narrative so far from Poilievre is Canada is broken, but not what he's going to do to fix it. And so I think that's the juxtaposition the Prime Minister is seeking for. And that clip that you just aired was, in times of crisis, you know how we have stood up for Canadians. Can this guy handle it, and what would he do? And do you trust him to do the right thing?
Cool.
Yeah, I think the job of Prime Minister, I've heard, is one that you not readily give away. It's one that's taken from you. And I think in this interview, I saw a lot of the Prime Minister not really having something to campaign on in the next election. And, beyond self-serving and legacy reasons, there's nothing on offer there that's particularly compelling. It's more, in my opinion, a save the furniture kind of mode. The Liberal Party also, it doesn't have the same drive and momentum that it had in 2015, and people don't want to vote for it anymore.
Okay, Nasha, what do you think?
I think it's a bold move to run on a legacy when currently you're down in the polls and Canadians aren't buying what you've done. So while I do agree that the Prime Minister in this actual interview or podcast, he seemed comfortable. He seemed at home. He is being interviewed by a former MP from his party.
Current MP still.
Or, sorry, currently, my apologies, current. A current member of Parliament, but at the same time, he sounds arguably arrogant given where his party currently sits with Canadians. They are not doing well in the polls, which I'm sure we'll get to later. But to run on a record that is not resonating with Canadians is super intriguing to me, and I think it's an interesting strategic move.
Okay, let me pick up on the point you're making, Nasha, but also the point you made, Susan, because, you know, the Prime Minister does make this argument, and we heard a bit of it, that Canadians know him. They know where his values lie, and in a moment of crisis, there's a certain predictability about that. He makes the argument you don't know about Pierre Poilievre, despite the fact that Poilievre has been a politician for 20 years. But, you know, when you hear what Nasha is saying, Susan, is that enough? This idea that you know who I am, is that enough to convince Canadians that when it's time to vote, that you should still put your vote with the Liberals, despite what the polling numbers say?
Well, I think they have to. We're not in a campaign yet, Michael.
Really?
And people.
Really?
Well, okay. I think there's powder being kept dry.
Okay.
So I think until the writ is dropped, or until we get very close to it, until we get close to a budget, if we get that far, which I think would be sort of a platform type budget, the Prime Minister, by very dint of it, they are the policies of his government, has to stand up and remind people that in COVID we got you vaccines. There's a dental care program now that people who need it can have. Pharmacare bill's about to be passed. There's child family benefits. We stood the right place with Ukraine. You know how we operate as it aligns with Canadian values. So that's your jumping off point for me. That guy, he's been around for 20 years, and apart from taking a paycheck from the Canadian taxpayer, what do you know about him? So there's somewhere to start from, but then they've got to put more in the window. But I think the closer you get to an actual writ period is when you see the new stuff out.
Okay, I know you want to say something. You're looking very intently, Cole.
I do. Well, I think the difference between these two leaders is one that's tellable from both of these interviews. So we had Trudeau say with Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, okay, what Canadians know about me is that I care. I really care. Oh, geez, I care so much. And Poilievre had a recent interview that he did in the Walrus with Paul Wells, where he talked about compassion is about results, and you know it's not about getting up there, putting your hand over your heart, you know, bursting into tears and saying how much you care more than the other guy. It's about the results that you actually deliver for Canadians. So the difference is one guy's going to tell you how much he cares so much, and the other guy's going to drive results.
I think Canadian families can point to the results with daycare, with the Canada Child Benefit, the people who have dental care. There are results that can be pointed to. It's not for me to point them out. It would be for the Prime Minister to point them out with Mr. Poilievre. But if Mr. Poilievre wants to go show me the results game, I think that's a great one for Trudeau to be able to do. And what Trudeau can say is, well, what are you going to do? Well, what aren't you going to cancel?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But on what Susan's saying there as well, some of the examples of wins that the Liberal Party and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau are pointing to are things that came out of the Supply and Confidence Agreement. And those were things that the NDP were pushing. So while there may be other things that you've mentioned might be part of that Liberal legacy, there's also many that were a part of an agreement that has now been ripped up. On the Pierre Poilievre side of this, it's interesting that the Prime Minister, number one, is trying to use, again, that legacy that we just spoke about. Pierre Poilievre has his 4 pillars that he brings up time and time again, trying to point to the future, but isn't necessarily, in this particular case, attacking in the way that you would expect. And what I mean by that is his policy is not necessarily speaking to what the Liberals did. He is speaking to what he wants to do, not to defend him per se. But ultimately, I think what it comes down to when we're talking about this podcast is the Prime Minister seemed arrogant, speaking about a record that isn't resonating with voters. And we've seen the polls, and we know that to be true.
Okay, you use the word arrogant, but I do, which I'm not using, but I do wonder whether or not the Prime Minister is underestimating Pierre Poilievre, because, you know, when in that interview, we heard the same argument that we've been hearing ever since the Liberal Party convention, you know, more than a year ago, spring here in Ottawa, where Liberals were saying, once people know Pierre Poilievre, they're not going to cast a vote for Pierre Poilievre. And that is the only argument we've mainly heard from Liberals, the only argument really heard from the Prime Minister in this interview. And in the meantime, you look at polling numbers, and if they actually hold, the Conservatives could have the largest majority ever in the House of Commons.
So on the day Pierre Poilievre was elected, I was sitting with you at the table, I said the Liberals need to brand him immediately. They need to go after him. They need to say who he is and not allow him to define himself. They failed to do that. So they are counting on, and I don't know if they'll be able to turn it around. It's looking very difficult to do so. They've allowed Poilievre all the time in the world to brand himself and to say whatever else he wants. And there have been no seeds planted about what he's actually like. It's a squandered opportunity. In my opinion, it's going to come back and bite them. And I think the Prime Minister talked about in the podcast he said, maybe we should have, I don't know. But what his view was, do it closer to the election. But I think the runway's gotten really short. So,
well, and at the very least, they don't necessarily control the runway, right? That's
no, but the last thing I would say is, I don't know that people really like Mr. Poilievre. I just think at the moment, before they have to go to the ballot and really decide, they're thinking about what could they have that's different. And in the end, they'll decide, do I like Poilievre? Do I like Trudeau? Do I like the Conservatives? Do I like the Liberals? They'll make their call there. But I don't think the jury hasn't come in yet on whether Poilievre has a lot of people who really like them or people are just tired of Mr. Trudeau after 10 years.
Okay, Cole?
Yeah, I think that Trudeau is overestimating, underestimating his opponent and underestimating his lack of popularity. Conservatives are up 22 points in the polls. They're leading with men and women, every age demographic. They're up 22 points in BC, 37 points in Alberta, 32 points in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, 24 points in Ontario, and 15 points in Atlantic Canada. So outside Quebec, we're looking at supermajority territory here, so it looks like a bit of a blowout, and I think Trudeau, it doesn't really have a clear picture of how unpopular he really is.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll add to the number, because less the Conservative numbers, but when you look at the latest Abacus data poll, if you actually take Quebec out, because it looks like the Bloc's going to, whenever this vote happens, the Bloc's going to have a good election if the numbers hold, but the NDP outside of Quebec, countrywide, is now number 2. They're in second place. Statistical tie in real terms with the Liberals, but symbolically in second place ahead of the governing party. What do you say to that, Nasha?
So with that new polling coming out and all of the statistics that we just heard right there, I think it is clear that Canadians are seeing that there is more than 2 parties that can form government. So while, of course, we see the Conservatives, the polling is looking absolutely the best for them at this particular moment in time, the NDP is gaining and the Liberals are losing. They are starting to hemorrhage staff, they're hemorrhaging their own nominated candidates. It's not going very well for them. Whereas the NDP, we've seen 3 MPPs in Ontario, for example, seek the federal nomination because there is momentum for the party happening. And whether that means they have a chance to face off against Pierre Poilievre for that prime minister role, or whether they're looking at official opposition, I think they are showing that they are the ones to go up against in the upcoming election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think if I look at BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, these are all provinces in which it's a blue versus orange world. The Liberal brand is pretty much dead in all of those provinces. In Ontario and Quebec, the Liberal Party is in 3rd place. And I think Trudeau is sinking that ship even further in those provinces. So I think the main point is, if the Liberal Party didn't exist today, would you invent it?
Okay, final word, Susan.
I think the answer is yes. Because Canadians like the middle of the road, and they don't like to tilt too far left, they don't like to tilt too far right or even farther right. They like to hang out in the middle, and that's why the Liberal Party has been the brand that it has been all along. I think this Liberal Party has to shore up its brand, and they have to bring a compelling narrative to Canadians in the next election. But we know I've been around long enough to know the Canadian electoral process, or the cycle, right? It's kind of every 10 years. Just ask Stephen Harper.
Okay. I like hanging out with you guys, FYI, just for the record. Susan, Cole, Nasha, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, it's not breaking news to say the Prime Minister is struggling in the polls, but polls analyst Philippe Fournier is offering an interesting take on the impact of Justin Trudeau's struggles, writing an article in the Walrus magazine with the headline, "Liberal Freefall Fuels Quebec Sovereignty." To tell us more, we're now joined by Philippe Fournier, the man who started 338 Canada. Philippe, good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Michael.
Now, I think, to be fair, you did not write the headline of this, but I still think the article you wrote that led to this headline is very interesting because, you know, it does point to not only Liberals doing poorly nationally in the polls, but also sovereignist parties in Quebec doing well right now. So let's walk people through this, beginning with, I think, to understand the argument, we need to look at where things currently stand in the polls with the Liberals 20 points behind. What's the seat projection that 338 is giving the party right now?
Well, at the national level, at the federal level, we see the Conservatives are hovering around 220 seats, which would be the greatest caucus in size in Canadian history, and the Liberals are hovering around the 60-seat mark. But this does not include this week's polls, and we saw that the numbers went down again for the Liberals this week, so we're going to have to readjust that. But the point of the article, basically, Michael, was that the by-election in La Salle et Verdun offered a glimpse of what could be at the next general election, especially in Quebec. Because in Quebec, the Liberals have lost maybe somewhere around 8 or 10 points on average. But in the by-election, we saw they dropped 16 points. And so what happened there? We have to remind viewers that polls measure theoretical support. Sometimes when you get into an election, theoretical support is not necessarily equal to actual support in the voting booths. And the scenario is, look, the Bloc Québécois won with 28% of the vote. It was a split vote. Well, there are many ridings in the province of Quebec where a split vote could cost the Liberals at the benefit of the Bloc Québécois. Oh,
and to that, we do have a board here for the Quebec portion of your seat projections. Let's put it up for people at home to see, because when you look at the actual numbers, you're looking at it, and really is that column that's more yellow on people's screen. 42 of Quebec seats is the projected lead that you give for the Bloc Québécois. The Liberals down to 21. Right. And that goes to something else that you say, that the Liberals could be looking at a collapse in the next vote. Is that hyperbole?
It's not hyperbole when you consider that the Liberals are down in Francophone Quebec. And in the past 3 elections with Justin Trudeau, the Liberals did do well in Quebec. They won more seats and won more votes than any other party in the province. But when you start losing those close races, including also in and around Montreal, so outside of the Montreal, Gatineau, and Laval area in Quebec, the Liberals won many seats in the past elections, but always by razor-thin margins. And so if we apply this swing that we see in the polls to the projection, we see that the Liberals would be wiped out of the Eastern Townships. They would probably lose everything they have in Quebec City, and even François-Philippe Champagne's seat in Saint-Maurice-Champlain would be in danger considering those numbers. And so in Francophone Quebec, the Bloc could really make some gains in the next election with those numbers.
So the Bloc could make gains, and when you talk about these bad numbers of Liberals helping fuel sovereignty, again, not your headline, but the extrapolation from what you're writing, you basically point to the fact that that would couple itself with a rise of the PQ provincially. So what would that actually do to the political discussion if the Bloc, for example, and in fact have enough seats, arguably they might even form official opposition here in Ottawa, if the Blockers are doing well, the PQ is doing well, what does that say to you?
Well, the Parti Québécois in the last provincial election had its worst result in the party's, near history, at least since they gained power in the 70s, with only 3 seats and 15% of the vote. But polling shows right now that they are in the mid-30s. And with the split vote that we see provincially here in Quebec, the Parti Québécois would be very close to a majority government. And Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon has made it clear there will be, those are his words, there will be a 3rd referendum on independence before the end of the decade. And so federally for the Bloc Québécois and Yves-François Blanchet, I mean, those two parties are cousins. Monsieur Blanchet, his mission would be to stop the Conservatives from gaining in Quebec, let the Conservatives have a majority in the rest of Canada, and turn to Quebecers and say, look, we are different. We are ready to go into another referendum campaign with the Bloc Québécois and the Parti Québécois hand in hand.
Okay, but those are the political parties. You know, the PQ might be saying there will be another referendum. The Bloc may support them in that, we don't know that for a fact. But what is the appetite for another referendum in Quebec right now?
Well, this is a crucial question, Michael. This is something that viewers have to remember. The sovereigntist parties, both the Bloc Québécois and the Parti Québécois, yes, they're doing well in the polls, and they could gain more seats in the next elections. But when we look at polling on the referendum issue and the independence issue, it has not moved in years. Usually we see fluctuations between 35% to 40% in favor of sovereignty, but it never goes above that threshold. And so even though the Bloc Québécois literally doubled its support since the last provincial election, support for sovereignty has not moved. And so there is appetite for sovereignty, but it's not increasing despite what we see at the performance of the Bloc Québécois and the Parti Québécois.
But still an interesting story to be percolating as the rest of Canada outside Quebec considers these numbers to see what's happening in the province right now. Philippe, thank you for this. Always appreciate the insight.
Always a pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
The Foreign Affairs Minister is once again encouraging Canadians in Lebanon to leave that country. Global Affairs has and is block booking seats for Canadians on commercial flights, but many of those seats are left unused. This despite the growing concern about fighting in Lebanon, including rocket fire that hit Beirut, as fighting between Israel and the group Hezbollah continues.
Today, we had 654 seats on 2 different flights from Beirut to Istanbul. We have scheduled a flight for tomorrow. We have another one scheduled for Saturday and another one for Sunday. Around 900 seats have been also secured through commercial flights. So please, if you're hearing this again, I want to make sure that you are brought to safety, and please take the seat.
Well, with more on the situation in Lebanon, we're now joined by Jon Allen, a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He is also chair of Project Rosanna Canada, a nonprofit that seeks to build bridges between Palestinians and Israelis via the health sector. And also from 2006 to 2010, Mr. Allen was Canada's ambassador to Israel. Jon Allen, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Listen, so many challenges on the ground right now, but I want to begin with the Canadians who are in Lebanon right now. According to Global Affairs, more than 24,000 people are registered with the department, but when it comes to these seats that Global Affairs has actually block booked to get Canadians out, only hundreds have actually been used. So to that, I'm wondering, why do you think those seats on these planes to get to safety are not being used?
Well, I think we have to realize, Michael, that the vast majority of Canadians in Lebanon right now are not tourists. They're not there on vacation. These are people that are dual nationals. They may be older and retired, cheaper to live in Lebanon, joining their families there. They may be young business people who have taken their skills and are working or running businesses in Lebanon. So you're talking about people who, unless forced to or unless feeling extremely insecure, want to stay. And unless and until the bombing gets very, very serious, and unless until they feel their security is threatened, they're going to try and stay as long as possible. And then, of course, at the last minute, they're going to demand that the Canadian government get them out, which is what always happens.
What always happens. How challenging is that, though? Like, I mean, at this point, and we've heard it from the government, commercial flights are still available. There's no guarantee that will remain the case. How challenging is that situation for Global Affairs?
Well, it is challenging because these people are basically placing a bet. And the bet is that they can stay as long as they want, and ultimately the government is going to feel pressured to get them out and will do whatever it takes to try and get them out. And then they'll complain because it didn't happen fast enough or they didn't end up in the city that they wanted to. I mean, I don't want to be too critical here, but this scenario has played out any number of times. In 2006, Canada had to evacuate 14,000 Canadians because they waited too long, and the situation in Beirut especially, but in other cities, got very scary.
Yeah, which explains why when we heard the foreign minister today encouraging people to get out, she really keeps asking more time and time again for them to leave. You know, we'll keep tracking the situation, but, you know, while I have you here, Jon, I do want to ask you about how you feel in this moment, because you have this past working relationship with Middle East, but you also work with an organization that attempts to build bridges. So what's it like to have seen the violence and tensions, you know, not only in the Middle East, but here at home as well?
Well, we've been working Project Rosanna, which has affiliates around the world. We've been working long before this war in Gaza began on October 7 or just after October 7. Our aim is to bring Palestinians and Israelis together in a situation of mutual respect and dignity, and it's all in the health sector. So we train nurses, we train psychologists in PTSD in children. We provide primary health care to women and children in remote West Bank villages. And right now, we're working with a partner called Anira, setting up tents in the heart of Gaza to be treating children, women, and others who, frankly, because of the lack of hospitals and medical staff, have no medical care. So it's of course it's disappointing. Right now we're in an emergency situation, but in normal times we've got 250 Palestinian nurses and 250 Israeli nurses training together in subspecialties. Palestinians learning Hebrew, the Israelis learning Arabic, and they take courses in resilience and in peace and conflict, etc. So it's extremely disappointing. It's extremely disappointing to see the polarization that's developed also in Canada, where progressive Jews like me who have supported a two-state solution and opposed the occupation and settlements and have been working with Palestinians on the ground are having difficulty finding common ground with Palestinians who are devastated by the fact that so many of their relatives have been killed or injured or forced to flee. You know, in the past, rabbis and imams and ministers could get together when that family was killed in London, Ontario, that Muslim family, or when there was a bombing of a synagogue in Pennsylvania. The three religions could get together, they could acknowledge their mutual pain, they could support each other. Following October 7, there's been great difficulty in even that happening. And so for me, you know, the important thing is for Jews and Muslims and Christians to try and find in their hearts enough space to have sympathy for everyone that has been killed or injured or displaced. I mean, that's where we have to go. And ultimately, that's what the region needs. I mean, ultimately, Israel is not going to be safe and secure until the occupation's over and until they can work out an agreement with Palestinians. And it's going to take hard work by the Palestinians, too. This does not all fall on Israel's shoulders. But we're going to need a two-state solution if all of the violence that we see now and in the past is going to be dealt with.
Jon, I appreciate the words and the sentiment this evening. Thank you for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Thursday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow. Until then, take care.